Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Is security now the #1 issue for you at this general election? And if it's not, what is? Do let me know. Get in touch throughout the morning. Use the hashtag #VictoriaLive. If you're texting, you'll be charged at the standard network rate. So voting in our election just under 48 hours away now. And after Saturday's attack on London Bridge and Borough Market, which came less than a fortnight after the Manchester bomb, Britain's response to Islamist terrorism has been thrust to the centre of campaigning. Which party can better protect us? We'll talk about this with representatives of various parties in just a moment. First, here's where Labour and the Conservatives stand on the issue. Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn say they are best placed to keep Britain safe. So what is their track record and what would they do? The Conservatives have flagged up Jeremy Corbyn's history of repeatedly voting against anti-terror legislation. Labour have suggested Theresa May has herself voted against anti-terror legislation in the past. Mr Corbyn says Theresa May presided over a 19,000 fall in police numbers as Home Secretary, prompting him to back calls for her to resign in the wake of the London Bridge attacks. Mrs May says she's protected counter-terror police numbers and that Jeremy Corbyn opposes shoot-to-kill powers. So who is correct? A BBC News reality check investigation found that police numbers have fallen by around 19,000 since 2010.
On your watch as Home Secretary, the number of armed police officers fell. It's still lower than it was in 2010. The number of officers fell in total by 20,000, as we've been hearing. And also control orders that monitored terrorists were watered down. Would it not be leadership to say that you would reverse those cuts?
We have enhanced the powers for the police. We've ensured that the security and intelligence agencies have the powers that they need. But it's not just about resource, it's about the powers people have.
Meanwhile, in a BBC interview in November 2015, Jeremy Corbyn did say he was opposed to shoot-to-kill. He now says he supports the use of proportionate and strictly necessary force.
These are your words. I'm not happy with shoot-to-kill policy in general. I think it's quite dangerous and can often be counterproductive. That was your view in 2015. What's your view now?
My view has not changed. In a defensive position where security of individuals is at stake, then what happened in Westminster, what happened over the weekend, what is about saving people's lives.
So you back shoot-to-kill now?
What I back is a police force that is adequately prepared and able to deal with a terrorist attack such as we had on Saturday, where they had to take the necessary action.
Here's how their record stacks up on other issues. The Terrorism Act of 2000, introduced by the last Labour government, was a law that gave a broad definition of terrorism for the first time and gave the police power to detain terrorist suspects for up to 7 days. Theresa May was absent on the final vote. Jeremy Corbyn voted against it. A measure to allow police up to 14 days to question terror suspects. Theresa May voted against it. Jeremy Corbyn voted against it. On ID cards, Theresa May voted against them. Jeremy Corbyn too voted against them. On control orders, which were a form of house arrest for suspects, Theresa May voted against them. Jeremy Corbyn voted against them. In 2011, Theresa May introduced TPIMs. They replaced control orders. Mrs May said they would be better focused than control orders. She voted for them. Mr Corbyn voted against them. Then, on the law that allows communications to be intercepted, Theresa May voted for it. Jeremy Corbyn was absent for the vote. With 3 terror attacks in 3 months, security is suddenly at the top of the election agenda, with both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn accusing each other of being soft on security. Really interesting to hear from you. This tweet from Paul: security is just one of my concerns. All our public services have been cut to the core, says Paul. They all need more money. John says security is obviously essential, but don't lose sight of the state of the country under Tory rule. Don't trust them. Louise says the biggest issue for me is the last chance to save the NHS. Adam, security is important, but also social cohesion is important too and depends on investment in public services, especially education. Jonathan emails to say, my greatest concern is that of climate change and protecting the environment. It's somewhat alarming that no party other than the Greens have given any mention of this. Really interested to hear from you, wherever you are in the country. Is security now the #1 issue for you ahead of this election? And if it's not, do let me know what is. Let me introduce you to Oliver Dowden, who was Deputy Chief of Staff to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. He's the Conservative candidate for Hertsmere. Richard Bergen has been Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary. He's a candidate in East Leeds. Lord Brian Paddock speaks for the Lib Dems on security and terrorism issues. He's a former Deputy Assistant Commissioner with the Met Police. David Curtin is from UKIP. He's a candidate for Castle Point. And Drew Hendry is standing for the SNP in Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey. Thank you all very much for talking to us. Now, we can talk about prison sentences or the vile videos you can access on YouTube or more anti-terror legislation or police numbers. None of those areas addresses, however, this, that there are young men living in Britain who are prepared to kill others and then themselves. So how would you stop people like that from becoming radicalised? I'll start with you, David Curtin from UKIP.
Yeah, well, we do have to be honest that this is the case. And
how would you do it?
Well, you say that police numbers is not an issue. It is an issue. I mean, 20,000 police have been cut. We know where we're going to get the money from to re-put those 20,000 police in place. Because
how would that stop young men from becoming radicalised?
There is a hole in community policing at the moment. Community policing is where you gather intelligence and you build relationships with people in communities where this is happening. Well, 20,000 of them have been cut. You know, the police has become very, very good at rapid response, at reacting to crisis. And we saw the heroism this weekend. But when there's no community policing or that's been cut, then there's a gap in actually building relationships with these communities and trying to stop things at the grassroots. So we need to make that happen as well.
Okay. I mean, we had more police officers before 7/7. 3 men were radicalised.
That's true, but you know, this time there's been 3 terrorist attacks in 3 months that have got through the net. Before we had 10 years without one, so that's after there's been cuts in community policing.
What would the Lib Dems do, Brian Paddock?
We need to review and replace the current PREVENT programme. A lot of people in the Muslim community are very suspicious of it. We need a much more community-based approach where mainstream Muslims can put out a counter-narrative to this poisonous, what is a political ideology. It's not. It's a violent political ideology. It's not a religion. There is a powerful counter-narrative that can be put out there, and we need to make sure that we support those communities.
And we know, in terms of numbers, we know that security officials are looking at 3,000 persons of interest. There are, at any one moment, 500 live investigations. There are 23,000 potential jihadis in this country. So replacing PREVENT would stop those people from becoming radicalised?
It's one piece of the jigsaw. Obviously, community policing is another very important idea. We heard an interview with one of the neighbours of one of the people involved at the weekend, where he said, you know, this guy, he was being over-friendly to me during the day on Saturday. If there is better community policing, where there is somebody that that person trusts, pass that information immediately. And that's why Liberal Democrats are pledging 60% more cash than Labour in terms of it boosting community policing.
OK. Oliver Dowden, a Conservative candidate. I have not yet met a Conservative representative who acknowledges that a cut of 20,000 police officers has an impact on neighbourhood policing, and that has an impact on building trust in communities and therefore local intelligence gathering. Are you going to acknowledge that link?
Well, actually, if you look at what Lord Carlisle said, who's a former Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament, former reviewer of counter-terrorism, he has said that police resources is not an issue in relation to counter-terrorism. They have the resources that they need, and I agree with that.
And you'll know there are counter-arguments. What about police officers themselves, the Police Federation, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, who've all expressed concern about neighbourhood policing?
Well, actually, if you look at the record now, we are protecting the police budget going forward, and actually we're now recruiting more armed police officers.
So you're not going to not acknowledge the link?
Well, I accept.
Others
I think that
say is relevant.
Let's take a very independent person, Lord Carlisle, who has said that this is not a relevant consideration in relation to tackling terrorism. Now, there is a debate about police numbers and community policing, but in terms of its impact on attacks like this, he is saying this is not the issue.
Well, let's bring in Labour's Richard Bergen then, who's a candidate in East Leeds. Are you saying that if we had the same numbers of police officers that we had in 2010, Richard Bergen, that Manchester or London wouldn't have happened?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the responsibility for those atrocities lies with the terrorist murderers who carried them out. In terms of the question you're asking, the chain of causation isn't so simple to say if this hadn't have happened, then these atrocities wouldn't have happened. But when we look at it on a common sense basis, as Sadiq Khan said on the television today, a cut in police of 20,000, including while Theresa May was Home Secretary, doesn't make us more safe, it makes us less safe from everything from low-level antisocial behaviour right through to acts of extreme violence.
OK. Drew Hendry from the SNP, how would you stop young men living in Britain from becoming extremists, jihadis and wanting to blow up their fellow citizens?
Well, these events in Manchester and London are shocking, brutal acts of criminal terror. And, you know, I think it's very important that we remember those people and victims who've been affected by this and their families just now. But this is a time to respond rather than react to the events. We have to make sure that we're looking carefully at what's caused this and how we take things forward. So I think knee-jerk reactions are not the way to go.
I mean, I'm not asking for knee-jerk reactions in particular. I'm just wondering if there's been any intellectual thinking within the SNP about how to stop young men from becoming radicalised in Great Britain.
Well, nobody has all the answers to these issues.
I think any suggestions?
Well, no, I'm just going to come to that. Nobody has all the answers to these things, but one of the ways that we can help to prevent the insidious message of those people who want to radicalise young people getting through is to create stronger communities and make sure that those communities are actually more resistant to the messages that these people would like to perpetrate. And that happens by working with young people, by making sure that there's early intervention, as there is in Scotland in schools, with discussing this through the Curriculum for Excellence and opening up people's minds to enable them to challenge some of the dogma that actually comes through from these radical organisations.
And is that working?
Well, you know, the time will tell. Obviously, as I said, nobody has all the answers. But what we do see is that the most effective way to combat the aims of terrorism, which is to disrupt the rights of people, our civil liberties, and of course the right of law, is actually to show that their message isn't working. I mean, those fantastic images in Manchester of the police dancing, you know, with the revellers there, I think are images that actually show that the community response is often most effective. OK,
let me ask all of you about Karoum Butt, one of the 3 London Bridge attackers. Reaction to the fact that MI5 investigated him 2 years ago, found there was no evidence of preparing a plot, planning a plot, no evidence of conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism. So therefore they downgraded their scrutiny of him. What would you do with someone like that, who's clearly a radical, because we all saw him on TV just a year ago? What do we do with someone like that when there is no evidence?
Well, our leader, Paul Nuttall, has said that Islamism is a cancer that's infecting this country.
So what would you do
it's
with
just
him?
got so big. You know, there's not just a small number of people. We told there's 23,000 potential jihadis as well
so what
in
would
the
you
country.
Do with someone like Karoum Butt?
We got to have a multifaceted approach. We've got to stop jihadis from coming into the country who have been abroad and fighting with Islamic State. That's one thing.
This guy was born in Pakistan. He's a British citizen.
Yeah. Well, there you go. He's been given British citizenship. He's clearly an issue.
So you wouldn't have had him in the country in the first place?
Someone like that, who perhaps has dual citizenship, who is potentially a threat, you know, a terrorist threat.
But let's deal with the fact that he was here.
Yeah, he was here.
He was investigated. There was no evidence. What do you do with him then?
Well, we really need to look at, you know, the funding of Wahhabi and Salafist mosques and anyone who is connected in that way. Anyone who's connected to. Well, with someone like him who has dual citizenship, apparently I think he's got citizenship in Pakistan as well, you can strip people of their citizenship if they have dual citizenship, if they are connected in any way with Wahhabism, Salafism and Islamism, and we need to do that.
All right, Oliver Dowden for the Conservatives. With that individual in particular, what in the future, what should we do with someone like that?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is, from my time working in Downing Street, I know the challenges facing MI5 with these. So obviously they can't be surveying every single person.
But they did look at him.
Yes.
There was no evidence.
Yes.
So they downgrade their scrutiny of him.
Yes,
is that the right thing to do?
Yes, it is the right thing to do, in the sense that it has to be based on the intelligence that they have. Because
so you wouldn't bring back control orders, for example, put him under curfew with an electronic tag?
In terms of the top category, those are people who are actively being followed all the time. You simply can't do that with the numbers, but you do need to look at the powers that the security services and the courts have to deal with these people. Now, you mentioned TPIMs, that is one way of dealing with it. I think in the light of this, it is important that we look at the legislative base to see if there are other measures, for example, to control the movement of people like this, to control their ability to, for example, get access to vehicles. You know, look at how they plan this and see are there other powers that we need to control their movement, short of active surveillance, constant surveillance, or putting them in prison. And I think that's what the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister have been talking about.
We'll hear from Lib Dems and then Labour and the SNP. Brian Paddock for the Lib Dems.
You mentioned TPIMs. TPIMs, you can put people under curfew. You can electronically tag them. You can actually move them up to 200 miles away from where they live at the moment in order to disrupt their activity.
Access to the internet?
The second question is, ISIS was a proscribed organisation when Butt was filmed in the park with an ISIS flag. That is a criminal offence. There was evidence to arrest arrest Butt for a criminal offence at that time.
Right.
What we're saying generally is the legislation is there, the powers are there. We have to look very carefully at why they're not being used more effectively.
Right. I mean, I think there's some suggestion that perhaps that wasn't an ISIS flag, but to any sensible person, he was clearly a radical.
You don't need it, because it's carry any article in public which arouse reasonable suspicion that an individual is a member or supporter of a prescribed organisation.
Okay.
Anybody looking at that footage would say, I think that person is a supporter of ISIS. They should have been arrested.
All right. So Richard Bergen of Labour, what would you have done with that man?
Well, first of all, I would like to start by saying that the security services need to be congratulated on all the terrorist plots that they have foiled, and no security service can guarantee that every plot by a terrorist, murderous lunatic can be stopped. But of course, it is disturbing to hear that this individual, this murderer, was so far on the path to so-called radicalisation. Well, we need to look into the specifics of what happened, what the security services knew, what the police knew, and what could have been done. But the wider point I'd make, actually in relation to the murderer from Manchester, is it very much disturbs me that it appears that the murderer from Manchester, the terrorist from Manchester, had been to Libya to fight against the regime there, and had seemingly been welcomed back or given the green light to come back. And I think we've got to be very careful that we don't have a government which pursues the doctrine of our enemy's enemy is our friend, because if we do, then there can be unintended, dangerous consequences to the British people.
So you would have stopped him coming back, are you saying? Even though he was fighting Gaddafi, which was also British policy at the time when he was fighting Gaddafi's regime?
I think the pursuit of the policy of just because some people are enemies of the enemies of our government, that we should not look into them properly or presume that they are not extremists, is very dangerous.
All right, Drew Hendry, what would you do with the individual Karoom Butt?
Well, I think we saw with the events in London that when the police have the resources, they're able to respond in a fantastic way.
We're talking about stopping people before, trying to stop people before they carry something out.
Yeah, but Victoria, I'm going on to make a point here. I think if you know about somebody and the police and the security services have the resources to look into that individual and make sure they're properly monitored, then that can be effective. And what we've seen at the time when police numbers have been going down dramatically in England, in Scotland, they've actually been rising over the same period. It is absolutely vital that those people who are charged with looking after us are given the resources in order to do the job, in order to make sure that these people are watched, and in order to make sure that they can respond when required.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Here's an email from Akbar Khan who says we need new approaches much greater engagement with Muslim communities, a programme of de-radicalisation of medium to long-term duration, closing down of Muslim religious TV channels in foreign languages, controlling of mosques in some ways are just a few steps which could be taken immediately. Cancellation of British citizenship too, and deportation could also be looked at. Security has been a #1 issue for me for a long time. Do keep those coming in wherever you are. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and your contributions this morning.
First of all, though, today, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has warned that the Metropolitan Police is facing the loss of thousands of frontline officers under Conservative spending plans. Mr Khan says Scotland Yard could lose up to 40% of its constables, making it harder to prevent future terror attacks.
Under a renewed Theresa May government, as a consequence of the cuts to our policing budget, we'd have fewer police officers. And all the experts tell me, by the way, that one of the ways we counter terrorism is by fantastic policing in the community. Members of the community of all backgrounds report intelligence to police officers in the community. They pass it on, and that helps keep us safe. So there's no doubt fewer police officers means we're in more danger.
Sadiq Khan. Well, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, rejected Labour's criticism, defending the government's record on spending on the police and security services.
I have to say, I think that is, first of all, that is wrong. Police numbers in London have remained high. And secondly, we protected police budgets in 2015. And the Labour Party, as I recall, actually wanted to cut them by 10%. But all that argument detracts from the responsibility of these scumbags of what they have done, and we should not allow that to happen.
Boris Johnson. Well, in the last hour, the Metropolitan Police have said they believe the third London Bridge attacker was Youssef Zagbar, a Moroccan-Italian man who was not a subject of interest to the police or MI5. Well, we're joined now by our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. How damaging is this continuing row over numbers of the police and security services and resources in general in terms of the government?
I think it's damaging because it just stops Mrs May getting onto the agenda she wanted to focus on in the last days of this campaign. She wants it to be about Brexit, and yet again and again when she's out and about, what she's challenged over is this reduction in police numbers. And why it matters so much is because it's very, very personal to Mrs May. She was Home Secretary. She presided over this cut in police numbers of around 20,000. The other thing that strikes me about it is it's a very simple concept for voters to grasp. It's not one of these much more difficult issues like the social care cap and the U-turn over that. A cut in police numbers is a very simple idea to get hold of. And the last thing that I think compounds the difficulties Mrs May is facing is this reluctance to openly concede that, yes, she has presided over a significant cut in police numbers. And I think, you know, we saw that to some extent with the social care row, with Mrs May unwilling to concede there's been a U-turn. And I think it just grates with voters a bit. I think they find it a bit exasperating that Mrs May is unwilling to concede what is just a fact. The police numbers have been cut.
And what about for Labour? Is there a difficulty on the doorstep, do you think, for those Labour candidates if there is an impression that Jeremy Corbyn is being viewed as soft on terror because he hadn't voted in favour of numerous counts of terrorism legislation?
Well, that clearly is the hope and calculation of the Conservatives, who today have tried to sort of shift the focus onto Mr Corbyn and Diane Abbott's own record and their opposition to previous anti-terror legislation. I think it's harder for them, frankly, when you have individuals like Sadiq Khan coming out with really this very stark suggestion that it's not just historic police cuts, but the Met is to face ongoing police cuts. He says around 400 million or more, which he says could mean a reduction between 10 and 40% of the total police force. And it's harder to be so dismissive of a figure like Sadiq Khan, in part because Theresa May and others have come out and publicly praised him in his handling of the aftermath of the terror attack.
Norman Smith, thank you very much. Well, we've been joined from Bristol by the former Conservative Chief Whip, Mark Harper, and from Birmingham by Labour's Jack Dromey. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Okay. Mark Harper, first of all, we've seen now that one of the terrorists involved in Saturday's attack was previously featured in a programme quite recently, last year, called The Jihadis Next Door, and had been reported to the authorities. This does now look to be a pretty extreme case of hiding in plain sight. What went wrong in your mind?
Well, I listened to what Mark Rowley said this morning, the head of the Counter-Terrorism Command, and he made it clear, I think I'm right in saying, that the Metropolitan Police had investigated this particular individual and they'd obviously looked at all of the evidence and that they couldn't find any evidence that he was involved in planning a terrorist attack of any description. And I believe they then placed him in a group of individuals who they keep who they're alert to and keep an eye on, but he hadn't been planning anything, so they did the investigation. And I believe that's what he set out this morning very clearly.
Yes, but people will find it very difficult to take that, bearing in mind what's happened and the fact that he's been identified. When they saw him, many of our viewers, in this television documentary, it was in 2016, last year, on Channel 4 News, where he's shown quite clearly in the company of people who would be deemed to be a threat to security. And you have got legislation, of course, in place that makes organisations, prescribed organisations, being banned, or the glorification of terrorism an offence. So should he have been a higher-up priority for the security services?
Well, look, I don't know what information the security services had available to them. I mean, I think generally they performed very well. They foiled, as we know, 18 plots over the last 3 years. One of the things the Prime Minister set out after the terrible events at the weekend in London was that we do need to do more to deal with people on extremism.
What concrete things could you do more than have put this man, Karim Butt, on a list? High up priority for the security services?
Well, I think one of the challenges here, Joe, and this is why it's not an easy matter to deal with, is that my understanding is he hadn't committed any criminal offences. And so the challenge for the law enforcement bodies is how do you deal with people who you believe might be a threat but haven't yet done anything? That's, of course, why we've got the TPIMs, the terrorism prevention orders, which can keep people under certain restrictions.
But they're barely used. They're barely used, Mark Harper. They're being used 7 times, and the list says there are 23,000 people who are a potential risk.
But you do have to have some evidence to be able to go before a judge to put those in place. So that's one of the things I think that the Prime Minister wants to look at. That's why we had in our manifesto, before any of these terrorist outrages, this new countering extremism panel we want to set up to bring forward those ideas. We are, of course, have a range of powers that we can use to deal with people. The Prime Minister, when she was Home Secretary, she banned more hate preachers from coming to the United Kingdom than any previous Home Secretary, thus keeping out of Britain people who would have tried to inspire this sort of terrorism. And those are the sorts of measures. There's no single magic solution to this. You have to look at a range of measures, strengthening sentences for people committing terrorism, looking at the TPIM regime,
and
making sure we continue to invest in our counter-terrorism
Let me put some of this
resource.
to Jack Dromey. I mean, it's true, isn't it, Mark Harper? If Karim Butt had not committed a crime and there was no evidence that he was going to plan an attack, Jack Dromey, then what could have been done to apprehend him ahead of this attack?
Well, there's 2 issues, one of powers and one of resources. On the issue of powers, we put in place when we were in government control orders which were much more effective. The Conservative Party then weakened that down. This TPIM regime scarcely used, and that was absolutely wrong. But the second thing is crucially resources. Cressida Dick yesterday was right to make this point, the new Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And the simple reality which the Conservative Party and Theresa May in particular will not face up to is that they have cut 20,000 police officers. We're 1,000 fewer firearms officers down.
All right, let me just pick you up on your issue on powers, because you referred to the last Labour government, but we need to look at the current Labour leadership.
Yes.
How many pieces of anti-terrorism legislation has Jeremy Corbyn supported?
Since Jeremy Corbyn's been leader, can I give 2 examples?
No, can you just answer that question? On anti-terrorism legislation, since 2000, which pieces of terrorism legislation has Jeremy Corbyn supported?
I'm going to answer the question. The first is that he supported Keir Starmer, myself, Andy Burnham, when together as the front bench team, we took through, in partnership with the government, the Investigatory Powers Bill, now the Investigatory Powers Act. And that gives to the police significantly greater powers to monitor terrorist suspects.
Right.
And the second example I would give is what's called the DAR clause, is that we persuaded the government to change the law so that in future, if somebody was arrested on suspicion of terrorism, they didn't escape the country like DAR did, but instead their passport was confiscated and they were kept under surveillance.
Right.
So in terms of practical measures, that's exactly the kind of thing we've done.
Except that, of course, he has proudly voted, Jeremy Corbyn, against 17 separate anti-terrorism laws over the course of his career. He called for Hamas to be removed from the list of prescribed terror groups and said that Brits shouldn't be banned from returning from fighting for ISIS. So when people look at that record, they will say, under Labour, under Jeremy Corbyn, nothing would have been done about Quram Butt. And in fact, in 2014, Jack Stromey, he said in the House of Commons, I have no support for ISIS whatsoever, and obviously that should apply to someone who has committed crimes, but we should bear in mind that expressing a political point of view is not in itself an offence. The commission of a criminal act is clearly a different matter, but expressing a point of view, even an unpalatable one, is sometimes quite important in a democracy. So he would not have locked up the people involved in this offence.
I've given two practical examples of exactly what he has supported us doing, he has led in doing since he's been leader in 2015. But also crucially, and this is what the public want right now, they want to see more police officers back on the beat. They want to see the rebuilding of neighbourhood policing, which Mark Rowley mentioned earlier on by Mark, the head of counter-terrorism, has made it abundantly clear is the eyes and ears of counter-terrorism. They want to see more firearms officers in the Metropolitan Police and nationwide. So I think what we've got to do is to focus right now on what's crucial is a great national unity to oppose and defeat terrorism. But it's about then the powers necessary and the resources to do it.
And do you think your front bench team need to know the powers and the recommendations that have been made by people within your own team? The report commissioned by Sadiq Khan, Toby Harris, did a report into how to keep London safe. It had a list of recommendations for the Metropolitan Police, and yet Diane Abbott, the Shadow Home Secretary, couldn't recall those recommendations. Do you think that inspires confidence?
Well, it was a good report, ranging from operational measures on the one hand.
So why couldn't she remember it?
Well, let me finish. To, on the other hand, fully funding the Metropolitan Police and our ambulance service in London. Now, I didn't see the interview, so I can't comment on that.
Right, well, let me just say, because that's the question I'm asking, because she wants to be Home Secretary, Diane Abbott. She couldn't recall the report at all. It was only done last year. It was commissioned by the Labour Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. As I say, do you think her failure to recall that will inspire confidence? And is that the reason she's not going to take part in the Woman's Hour debate today?
Well, again, I can't comment about today because I understand Diane is ill. But forgive me if I say this, is right now is not the time to engage in the wrong kind of party politics. Right now, what we've got to focus on...
Are you not engaging in party politics?
No, I tell you what, our nation is under threat from a uniquely awful brand of terrorism. We need a national unity to defeat that, and crucially, that does mean both powers and resources. And can I ask Mark this question? Mark, will you concede today what Theresa May refused to concede yesterday, that we have seen 20,000 fewer police officers under her as Home Secretary and now Prime Minister, and 1,000 fewer armed officers?
Right, Mark Harper.
Well, look, Joe, looks like Jack's bidding for your job there. Look, what I would say is this. I read Toby Harris's report that Joe referred to there about London's preparedness, which talked about these...
Jack, I'll come back to the issue of numbers in a second, but answer that question first and then we'll do the numbers.
In this report, I read it very carefully. Toby Harris is, of course, a Labour peer, and he wrote this report just last October, and he said... over the 5 years that he'd been stopped being involved in London policing and writing that report, he said that the resources available meant that the response in London would have been better than that from 5 years previously. So what that says to me, and looking at the professionalism and dedication of our police officers at the weekend, is that actually the Met does have the resources. We've protected the counter-terrorism budget. And Jack, when you were on the Home Affairs team in the autumn of 2015, after that election, Andy Burnham said that the police could deal with a further 5 to 10% cut in their budget. George Osborne, who was then the Chancellor, made it clear that we not only were we not going to cut the police budget, we were going to protect it. We've protected it since 2015. We're increasing the funded for armed officers, and we've also protected the counter-terrorism budget, and we're hiring more specialists to work in our excellent security services. And I know well as a Gloucestershire candidate about GCHQ based at Cheltenham.
Let Jack Dromey respond, and also to Lord Carlisle, Alex Carlisle's point. He was the former reviewer of terrorism legislation, who said it's not about more community police officers, which is what Labour in part is calling for.
Well, on that latter point, he's a distinguished reviewer of terrorist legislation, but if I can quote the head of counter-terrorism, Mark Rowley, and also the then Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Bernard Hogan-Howe, is that going back to 2015, Mark, on top of a 25% cut in your first 5 years in government, your government came within 36 hours of a further 22% cut. And one of the things that was key in changing the mind of the government, we worked very closely with the police to oppose that proposal, was a letter from Mark Rowley to the Home Secretary in which he said numbers were vital, including neighbourhood policing, because it's absolutely essential to intelligence gathering.
All right. I mean, aren't the numbers important, Mark Harper? It's what the public wants to hear at the moment. They want to be reassured that there aren't going to be, at the very least, further cuts. And what do you say to Sadiq Khan, who has said that the force could lose as many as another 12,800 officers, which would reduce its strength by 40%, making it harder to tackle the terrorism threat?
The first thing I do is go back and look at our record since 2015. We've protected the police budget. When the Chancellor, the then Chancellor, protected that police budget, the Labour spokesman, who was Andy Burnham, was arguing that police could manage to deal with a 5 to 10% cut. And George Osborne made it clear that we were protecting the police budget, and that was a decision by the then Chancellor George Osborne and the then Home Secretary Theresa May. We've increased the investment into. Jack, I listened to you.
Jack, don't talk over. Don't talk after Mark Harper, and then I'll give for a final word.
We've increased the budget for counter-terrorism, which is, of course, based out of the Metropolitan Police. And we've seen Mark Rowley, who's the excellent head of that, dealing so professionally with the events over the last couple of weeks. And we've also invested the resources in our security services, which, Joe, coming back to your first question, is essential in monitoring these appalling individuals and making sure, as they have done over the last 3 years, that they can continue foiling the plots of those individuals that wish to do us harm.
All right, I'm afraid I'm going to have to finish there. Sorry, Jack Dromey, I did say we would come back to you, but we've run out of time.
I've been getting away with it all my